Hi, and thank you for tuning in to this month's presentation of the Baton Rouge chapter of the Louisiana Archaeological Society. Today we have with us Ken Tremblay, who recently graduated as a master's student at LSU. Ken, congratulations.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to your research interests?
Sure. I guess I really started becoming interested in history in high school, and I knew that I really wanted to go into academia straight away. I went to undergrad, and while I was in undergrad, I kind of fell in love with anthropology as well. I double majored in history and anthropology. Um, and so, yeah, I had always been dead set on doing research. So it was just kind of chance that I landed at LSU. Um, I didn't have any connections here, but I'm very glad that I ended up here. And so, yeah, from here, I do plan on continuing to go get my doctorate and keep on trucking on this path.
Well, great. You go ahead and start your presentation anytime you like.
Okay. I did my master's thesis research on the Lake St. Agnes site. It's a very interesting site, excavated in 1972, and I'm excited to share my findings. So a bit about fragmentation and commingling before I get into my actual research. So fragmentation and commingling are pretty common issues that can be the result of both cultural and natural processes. Pretty common issue here in Louisiana is the acidity of the soil and the clay, but it can also be due to how individuals are buried and the types of activities that are going on the surface. And what it looks like to archaeologists is it's very difficult to analyze because we can't really piece out individuals. So because of this, we can't really compare individuals at a site. And so it's limited in its explanatory power. And so it's been historically overlooked, especially in the 20th century, in favor of these, convenient and complete burials, which has resulted in a sort of bias in how we understand the past. And that's something that I specifically wanted to approach with this and kind of fixing that issue. And so what I did was I approached this site with a very specific theoretical framework in mind that looked at community identity rather than individual identity as a comparative unit. So like I said, it's very difficult to piece together individuals that are buried at this site, but we can get an idea of what the group was doing and what the group looks like. So a bit about the location of the Lake St. Agnes Mound site and its excavation history. It's located in Avoyelles Parish, Louisiana. It's near the junction of the Red and the Mississippi rivers. That's especially the case in prehistory. And it's this lush system of lakes and bayous that would have been teeming with natural resources, would have facilitated easy water travel. And it's been professionally investigated many times in the past, as you can see, including recently, there's been a series of surface collections, surface surveys, as well as intensive excavations as well. I'm going to be focusing on Alan Toth's 1972 excavation because that is when they recovered these burials that I studied. He did 3 test pits west of the mound, which are located on clusters of surface finds, which are represented by these dots on this map here. And based on the surface finds, as well as the results of the excavation, Toth determines that the occupation of the site was from the Marksville period to the Plaquemine period, so around 200 CE to 1400 or so. In addition to the test pits that were dug west of the mound, they also removed the southwest quarter of the mound using a backhoe. And this was done in order to get an idea of how the mound was constructed and to see the profile of the mound. During this process, they uncovered multiple burials at the base, and they intended to also excavate another quarter of the mound, but during this process, they uncovered another set of burials at the top of the mound, and so they stopped that early. I was interested in looking at these burials to get a better idea of when maize agriculture was introduced into this region. It's not well understood when maize agriculture was introduced, so a bit of background about diet in the lower Mississippi River Valley. So the Baytown period, which is around 400 to 700 CE, was really marked by hunting and gathering subsistence. It's very common. Around 600 CE is when the bow and arrow was introduced into the region. And there's some consumption of garden crops, but there's not really any domestication. Later in the Coles Creek period, you start to see some of these native crops being domesticated, but really no evidence for full-scale agriculture. There's also some sparse evidence for maize, but it's been suggested that it's just likely ceremonial use. It's not, the evidence is not extensive for large-scale agriculture. And finally, in Plaquemine period, around 1200 to 1400 CE, you start to see some more intense maize consumption, but it's not large scale. It's only in these certain pockets. So I wanted to see if Lake St. Agnes could be one of those pockets. So my goals for this study were to complete a better inventory for the excavated remains. As I said, they're all fragmentary and commingled, so previous inventories have used kind of outdated methods. I wanted to use more up-to-date methods for inventorying to get a better idea of who was buried there. I also wanted more accurate dates for both burial components. The early burial component that was uncovered at the base of the mound is only dated, or is dated by a pottery as well as a radiocarbon date that was done in the early 2000s. But the later burial component is only dated by the ceramic ceramic evidence. I also wanted to explore this evidence for the possible change in diet over time. So in order to do that, I wanted to compare those burial components as their own communal units. So look at evidence for diet in the early burial component and compare that to the same types of things in the later component. So the dating, I'll start with. Like I said, based on the ceramics near the burials, Toth believed the early burial pit to be late Marksville, around 200 to 400 CE, and the later burial pit to be Plaquemine, around 1400 CE. McGimsey investigated the mound as well. He did a radiocarbon date of some cane matting that was located above one of the burials in the early burial component. And he produced a date of 680 to 880 CE. And he also believed that the mound was built in a single stage, so that the mound would also date to around this time period. More recent investigations produce evidence for possibly 4 layers, but I don't have a lot of information on that that investigation. So what I did was we submitted 4 new samples to CASE at the University of Georgia. Those samples include faunal bone from the early burial pit, the same burned cane matting that was dated in the early 2000s, but now as an AMS, and also 2 faunal bones from the late burial pit. And so the results, the cane matting came back as a date of 780 to 880, which is relatively consistent with McGimsey's, a little bit more precise, and it puts it squarely in the early Coles Creek period. The faunal bone had a little bit earlier date of 590 to 650 CE. The late burial pit includes 2 faunal bones with very different dates, one right around 1400 CE and the other right around 1000 CE. And the reason for this is that these faunal bones represent terminus post quem. So this is really just the earliest point that it could be. The reason for this is because these faunal bones are not really associated with the burials, but they are they could be part of an earlier midden that was used to backfill these burial pits. And so they could represent an earlier occupation. So we believe that the early burial pit, likely around 780 to 880, this burned cane matting is definitely associated with this burial. The late burial pit is probably around 1400. And I'll just show this for a second. These are all of the dates that come from the site. One interesting thing to note is that this burned cane matting had some tar on it that was initially dated. It could be some, waterproofing for basketry or whatever. We don't really know what it is, but probably like some bitumen or asphalt, that type of stuff that was used. Interesting, not super relevant to my analysis, though. So I wanted to get a sense of who was buried there. As I said, it's difficult to piece together individuals, but we can get an idea of how many adults are there, how many subadults, are there multiple males, multiple females. And in order to do this, I used standard methods for aging, using dental development, which is pretty biologically strict. I also use epiphyseal fusion, which is demonstrated here on this figure. These are evidence of growth and get an idea of how old an individual is up to a certain age. Is pretty accurate. Determining sex is a little bit more difficult, especially in fragmentary remains where you don't have multiple markers for an individual. But when it's possible, I used the standard cranial and pelvic features to determine sex. The minimum number of individuals is a pretty common way of quantifying sites. The traditional method for doing this, however, is really not amenable to fragmentary and commingled remains. For most of the bones, it's scored in 3 scales, or in a scale of 3 parts. There's less than 25%, 25 to 75%, or greater than 75% complete. And when you have most of the fragments are less than 25% complete, it's not really helpful for determining the minimum number of individuals. So I use this relatively novel method of a landmark-based MNI. I use 344 different landmarks across 17 elements. So you can see here on this figure, these are just some of the landmarks that I used for the humerus, the upper arm bone. And so this allows me to get more precision on these small fragments. So ultimately, the minimum number of individuals at the site is going to be equal to the greatest number of specific landmarks that are present. All right, so my results for the early burial pit, using the landmark-based MNI method, I produce an MNI of 4 individuals, and that is based on repeating right temporal fragments. That's cranial bone. Interestingly, the more traditional MNI method produced a minimum number of 5. This is because the landmark-based MNI does not really account for age and sex characteristics. So even though there were 3 right distal humeri based on landmarks, there was additional juvenile and neonate humerus fragments. So we know that there are 5 individuals present. There's 1 neonate, 1 juvenile, 1 adolescent or young adult, and 2 adults. But we can't really say with any certainty the sex of those individuals. For the late burial pit, both the landmark-based MNI and the traditional MNI method produced 8 individuals. The landmarks are based on the repeating femoral and occipital fragments, and the traditional MNI is based on a dental inventory with 8 mandibular left and right second molars. Here we have 1 juvenile, 3 adolescents, and 4 possible adults. Of those adults, 1 is a probable male and 1 is a probable female, but we can't get any more specific than that. Moving on to pathology and the evidence for change in diet. So some of the common characteristics that people look for is evidence for caries. You may know as cavities. Caries tends to increase in populations that transition to maize agriculture. This is due to the high carbohydrate rate in maize. There also tends to be a decrease in nutritional quality as people tend to rely more on maize and less on various wild fruits and nuts and meats. And so this produces a couple different pathologies, including linear enamel hypoplasias, which are created during dental development. They appear as depression lines on the teeth, as well as parodic cranial lesions, which are the result of typically iron-related anemias. There's also just tends to be a decrease in overall health, which can be seen in dental calculus, which is just calcified plaque, as well as periodontal disease, which is related to dental calculus in that it's a reaction of the alveolar bone close to where the teeth meet the gums. And so those are some of the things that are used as evidence for dietary change. Looking at these dental pathologies, I assessed caries, calculus, and linear enamel hypoplasias based on individual teeth. Ideally, I would be looking at individuals, but because these remains are fragmentary and commingled, I necessarily have to look at teeth individually. I also assessed periodontal disease by observable alveoli or tooth sockets. Parodic cranial lesions, I looked at cribra orbitalia, which is a parodic cranial lesion in the roof of the eye orbits, as well as parodic hyperostosis, which occurs on the exterior cranial vault. And these I assessed when those bones were greater than 25% complete. And the reason for this is to try to diminish the amount of repetition in the same individual being counted. The results of this were low rates of caries and linear enamel hypoplasia across both these early and late burial components. However, there was significantly more calculus in the early burial pit than the late burial pit. And why this is not very clear. It's possible that it has to do with the average age of these deposits, but you would also then expect the other pathologies to increase as well. What I did find was high rates of periodontal disease and parodic cranial lesions in both burial components, however. Moving on to dental wear. So dental macro wear is just the overall wear in the teeth. In agriculturalists, there's overall lighter wear and also a more uneven distribution. That wear tends to be in the posterior teeth rather than the anterior teeth. It also can produce this cupped or angled wear of the teeth, whereas in hunter-gatherers, there tends to be overall heavier wear, and this because they tend to be eating, more tough or fibrous materials. That wear tends to be evenly distributed throughout the dentition, even wear in the posterior and the anterior teeth, and that wear tends to produce like a flat plane. How I scored this was based on a couple different methods. Smith's 1984 for the wear in the incisors, canines, and premolars, which is seen here on the right. But I used Scott's method for scoring the molars, which is scored for each quadrant of the molar and then added together. As for the shape of wear, I described the wear for molars as either cupped and angled or flat. So what I found was that in the anterior teeth, there is relatively little wear, and that's seen in both burial components. It's not significantly different between the samples. In the posterior teeth, there's comparatively more wear than in the anterior teeth. There is also greater wear in the early burial pit than in the later burial pit, but I believe this is likely due to the average age of each burial component. I believe that the early burial component has, on average, an older paleodemography than the later burial pit. There's also evidence for both cupped wear and flat wear in each burial components. So there's this interesting kind of mix between, factors of agricultural subsistence and also factors for a more hunting-gathering subsistence. Dental microwear is really interesting. It looks at these microscopic pits and scratches that are caused by the grit in diet. And so there's historically been multiple different ways of analyzing this using a whole host of different technologies. The current way that's very popular is this dental microwear texture analysis that creates this 3D cloud of point data of the teeth. That's really expensive to use. I opted for a low magnification microwear analysis, which is relatively inexpensive and less time consuming. So there are two diagnostic parameters that are assessed for determining diet, and that is complexity, which has to do with the coarseness or the fineness of the scratches, and also the anisotropy, which has to do with the directionality of those scratches. Are they, high anisotropy is seen here. It all follows the same direction, whereas low anisotropy is in all different directions. So in agriculturalists, complexity tends to be low and anisotropy tends to be high. And that's because they're consuming very fine grit and also using relatively repetitive jaw motions to chew. And hunter-gatherers, they're eating a variety of different things with different grit sizes. So complexity tends to be high and anisotropy tends to be low. I looked at 10 teeth in total, 4 from the early burial pit and 6 from the late burial pit. This number was chosen because, again, I didn't want to have more than one individual represented, because, as you would expect, the same individual would likely have very similar microwear. In order to look at microwear, it's necessary to create these high-quality epoxy casts because the light needs to be shined through the teeth in order for these microscopic features to be visible. So I use this low-angled oblique lighting, this intense lighting, and I looked at the teeth at 35 times magnification. And what I found was there's not really any significant differences between the burial components. Overall, the complexity is low and the anisotropy is variable. So again, we see this kind of mix of agriculturalist traits and hunter-gatherer traits. So the way that I look at the site is through this lens of consistency between burial components, but also variability within. So while it looks like there's this retention of traditional subsistence practices, there is some variability in perhaps access to or preference for certain types of foods. Now, what this variability could mean, it could be seasonal. This could explain the microwear variability because dental microwear tends to be overwritten. It's really only evidence for, say, the past week of what the person was eating. But it doesn't really explain the pathology or the macrowear, which is accrued over time. Or it could be something else. An interesting comparison that I can make is from the Discovery site. They found similar variability like we see at Lake St. Agnes. There, they find that males likely had greater access to protein sources, whereas females may have had to supplement their diet with maize. This type of diet variability based on sex is possible for Lake St. Agnes, but it's really difficult to test because of the fragmentary and commingled nature of the remains. We're not able to piece together individuals and compare individuals like they were at the discovery site. So in conclusion, I set out to create a more complete inventory for the excavated remains. I believe that I did so using the new methods of the landmark-based methods. I set out to produce more accurate dates for both burial components, which I did using the AMS dating of both faunal bone and the cane matting in the early and late burial components. And I wanted to explore evidence for change in diet over time. And while I don't believe there's a change in diet over time, I do believe there is some variability in access or preference to certain types of food. So I wanted to thank you guys for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you for tuning in. I'll stop the screen share.
So thank you very much. I'm sure that people really like this because I know a lot of members from LAS participated in the excavations out there in 2017 and 18. Has anyone looked into the possibility that with the earlier burial, it seemed like it could have possibly been like a family? I don't know how hierarchy was back then, if it was like more achieved or ascribed, but has anybody done any studies as to if that might be, they might all be related?
There hasn't been a lot of, sorry, there's an echo there. There hasn't been a lot of research into the burials since Toth's 1979 publication. So no, to answer your question. But I think that that's certainly a possibility. It is interesting that there are only these 5 individuals, and it is a mound burial. Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of research done at this site, at least that's been published about these burials.
So you mentioned earlier in your presentation that you were checking to see if the site was one of those like pocket agricultural sites, correct? Is that what the discovery site is considered? Is that why the comparison came in?
They did. Their argument is that there is some. It's around the same time period, the Plaquemine time period, and they do argue that there is some maize consumption there. To supplement this diet, but there's unequal access to, or I guess access to the better protein sources, the better diet, and so maize is just the supplement.
Great, interesting.
And so while that's possible for Lake St. Agnes, it's hard to say for certain.
Well, I mean, it seems like this site just, it just keeps on giving and giving, because I know that, we've discussed it at LAS several times because of the excavations there. And it was wonderful to get this other side of it from you, the fauna remain investigation. So thank you very much. And I'd just like to thank our viewers again for tuning in. And I guess we'll see you for the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.